Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tunisia Owens, and I will be joining the group who will be presenting um, today on centering racial equity in our continuum of care. So if you all can unmute those who will be presenting to introduce yourselves.
I can go. Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe Green. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an independent consultant that is providing support to your community in various capacities, but primarily with the COC supporting the Racial Equity Committee. Happy to be here today.
I'll go next. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Ming, and I'm with Social Impact Wheel. I serve on the Racial Equity Committee, and I'm part of the group presenting today.
Good morning, I'm Darlene Flynn. I'm the Director of the Department of Race and Equity for the City of Oakland. Good morning.
Thank you. And I guess I did not introduce myself. I am Tunisia Owens. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at Family Violence Law Center in Oakland. I serve on the Racial Equity Committee as well. Thank you. Next slide. Our objectives today are to understand the responsibilities and the equity role of the continuum of care in Alameda County. Today, we'd also like to have those who participate understand the importance of centering equity in our homelessness response system and to explore how racism peers in our system using local examples. We'd like to also understand the role of system design and evaluation in advancing our racial equity goals, and then review local examples of centering racial equity in homeless system design. Next slide. We'd like to take time to acknowledge that this is deep work. This is long-term. It's not going to happen in a day. But this is also can be triggering and bring up challenges and issues for people. It's a lot to take in, and then also to provide examples in your own lived experience. And so we recognize that, and we'd like to give you space to take a moment if you need to. You can always reach out to us, send us an email, ask for support if you need it, but also we just want you to prioritize yourself and take whatever time you need to step away and breathe for a moment. Thank you. Next slide. So our continuum of care, we have roles and responsibilities, and each of those roles and responsibilities.
The video's off, and I'm muted, so. Whoops.
I'm sorry. Oh, that was not for me.
Yeah, you can continue, Tanisha.
Okay. And so within that, everyone has a role to play in advancing racial equity goals. And so we want to make that clear as we are talking about how to look at equity, how to evaluate whether or not our system is equitable, and what kinds of ways that we can advance equity, and then also to revisit what we've done in the past and what we could potentially do in the future if we are making changes now to advance equity. Next slide. So in general, the COC, and that includes all of us, is charged with designing a local system. And I'm air quoting system here because systems oftentimes have a bad name, a bad reputation. But if you have multiple parts that are engaging with each other for an outcome that is cohesive, it is a system. And so we want to think about how we design our system to prevent homelessness, to assist those who are homeless, the sheltered and unsheltered, and also to provide other services necessary to keep them housed and to prevent them from falling into homelessness again. So that's long-term housing, sustainable housing, and supportive housing when people need it. I'd like to talk a little bit about our governance charter. In our charter, and I'm going to actually read this statement aloud, we envision an end to all homelessness in Alameda County, California. To achieve this goal, we will center racial equity, amplify the voices of people who have experienced homelessness, and work together to implement comprehensive strategies to prevent and end homelessness in our county. So I'd like to take a pause right there to really think about that statement. That is a very strong statement. And it's recognizing the responsibility of everyone. This is not just the COC, but everyone who participates, everyone who lives in this county has a responsibility for our unhoused and unstably housed community. We are community members. We have to live together and recognize that our community is unsafe. It's less safe if we have any people who are unhoused, that we should all be uncomfortable with the number of people who are living in homeless encampments, with the number of people who are homeless. And then we also want to recognize that those people who have experienced homelessness in this community, in this county, have intimate knowledge and expertise in how to fix it and make it better, and to move things faster and to get us to an equitable place. And within all of that, we want to recognize that we have created systematic oppression. We haven't created it, but we are holding systems of oppression, systematic oppression. And so in order to dismantle that, we want to center racial equity as we are looking at homelessness in our community. In order for us to center racial equity, that means that we need to follow equity principles and follow those principles in making decisions and in our actions and activities. This is not happenstance, and so we cannot be willy-nilly about how we create the systems in order to advance racial equity. We have to, unless we make a commitment to equity principles, then we will return to the status quo, and racial disparities continue with the status quo. It's business as usual, and that is not what we want. We want change. We want to make it better. We want to end homelessness, and that means that we have to look at racial equity, because there are huge disparities in the numbers of people who are homeless in our community. That is why we focus so much attention on racial equity in our community. Next slide. The equity principles that we are talking about in our previous slides are encapsulated here, but they're system focused. We are outcome and data driven, and that means that we're looking at the numbers to tell a story and to understand our stories, to understand what's going on. Again, we recognize that that racial equity principles are not always at the forefront of other systems. And so here we see it very clearly how important it is to include racial equity. And so that's why we say we're systems focused, outcome and data driven. We need to shift, I'm sorry, I was going to continue. We need to shift people from being gatekeepers to agents of institutional transformation. And that means not holding back from providing as many resources as possible. We want to take action to identify and address the institutionalized racism that we see. We want to stay grounded in the history and local history and root causes of racial inequity. And we have to be accountable to those who are most impacted by these racial disparities. Next slide. One of the ways that we look at this is by looking at the leadership board and how we intersect with the Racial Equity Committee and the work that is being done. We have to operationalize equity, and that means including it in decision-making processes, and then also having that process be a part of the leadership of this organization. So the Racial Equity Committee is a catalyst for racial equity across the work of the continuum of care, and we are integrated into the leadership board in order to embed racial equity in everything that we do. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it off. If there are questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of Chloe's presentation on equity and racism and defining it.
Thank you so much, Tanisha, for that grounding and getting us started. So as she noted, your COC has made a commitment to center racial equity in your work to prevent and end homelessness. And part of centering racial equity is developing a shared understanding and commitment to equity and racism. And that really starts with intentional discussions and dialogue about what equity and racism are. So we want to get started on that collective journey here together. So wanting to do an introduction of equity. Let's talk a little bit about equity and what that is. There are various ways to look at equity and racism, and we're starting with the City of Oakland's definition as a starting place for you all, but as you all work together as a COC, this may certainly evolve and shift. But for today, equity is just and fair inclusion, explicitly, intentionally, including those from whom justice has been withheld, so that you can create an equitable society in which all can participate and prosper. The goals of equity must be to create conditions that allow everyone to reach their full potential. And at the root, creating those conditions requires system change that removes barriers to opportunity for those whom it has been withheld. And system change that removes barriers to opportunity can only be achieved when you target those barriers with great intentionality. And while equality, which is noted here on this slide in this visual, has the goal of prosperity for all, it only works when everyone is starting from the same place. But because of structural racism, we know that people experiencing oppression and injustice are not starting from the same place as people that have great proximity to privilege. So instead of giving everyone the same, which is what equality suggests, equity recognizes that ensuring access to the same opportunities requires different strategies and interventions based on your proximity to advantage and disadvantage, or the impact of racism on your life circumstances, which is noted here on the second part of the visual. And of course, since you are committing to working at the intersection of race and equity, we also want to begin to explore racism together. Again, we're just scratching the surface here, but giving you a starting place for your collective learning journey as a COC. This definition comes from Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones, who is a physician and an anti-racist activist, an all-around amazing person, who defines racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. So race is based on the social interpretation of how one looks. It's a social construction. And within that system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on these social constructions, there's an unfair disadvantage that is placed on some individuals and communities. There is an unfair advantage for other individuals and communities. And we are also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources as a result of racism. I like to use her definition because, again, it acknowledges that racism is not only leading to unfair disadvantages, but there are also unfair advantages as a result of racism, but also acknowledging that our entire society suffers as a result of racism, because when millions of people are kept from having the opportunity to thrive and to be well, not only are people experiencing great suffering, which we need to hold ourselves accountable to and for, but we lose out on the power, the brilliance, and the love that those people possess. And imagine all the amazing, beautiful things that could exist if we weren't sapping the strength of the whole society through the continuation of racism. Next slide. In addition to Dr. Jones' definition of racism, we also think it's really important to acknowledge that there are different levels of racism. Race Forward, which can be an incredible resource for you all moving forward about learning more about race and racism core concepts, has a levels framework that we're going to go through. And they note it's important to distinguish between the different levels of racism to focus attention on institutional and structural racism. And that doesn't mean that individual racism, which is also one of the levels that we'll talk about, isn't important. It's just meaning that racial justice cannot be achieved by remaining at the individual racism level. So it's really important that you understand the difference between these two levels, so you all can work together to develop strategies that are needed to dismantle individual racism, but most importantly, structural racism. And so they break the 4 levels into 2 categories, individual and systemic. Individual racism is racism that occurs between individuals or within a person. So the first in this category is internalized racism. And this is the racism that lies within an individual. These are the private beliefs and biases about race that reside in our own minds and our own bodies. And for white people, this can look like internalized privilege, entitlement, and superiority. But for people of color, this often shows up as internalized oppression, where you are internalizing and believing in the stereotypes and biases that are put out in society about people of color. Examples of this could be your own prejudices, xenophobia, and conscious and unconscious bias about race. And then there's interpersonal racism, which is racism that occurs between individuals. So you're now moving beyond the racism that may lie within yourself, and that is now occurring in your interpersonal connections and relationships with other people. And this shows up as our biases, bigotry, and discrimination based on race. And we are now bringing our private beliefs about race into our interactions with others. Examples of this could be public expressions of prejudice and hate, microaggressions committed against people of color, and bias and bigotry exhibited between individual people. You can go to the next slide. And then the other category is systemic racism, which is broken down into institutional racism and structural racism. Institutional racism occurs within institutions, and that involves unjust policies, practices, procedures, and outcomes that work better for white people, again, going back to that unfair advantage, than they do for people of color. And this can be intentional or not. An example of this would be a school district that concentrates students of color in the most overcrowded, underfunded schools with the least experienced teachers. And then there is structural racism, And this is racial inequities that exist across institutions, across policies, social structures, history, and cultures. Structural racism highlights how racism operates as a system of power with multiple interconnected reinforcing components, which result in racial inequities across all indicators of life. Structural racism is the racial inequity that is deeply rooted and embedded in our history and culture, as well as our economic, political, and legal systems. An example of this would be the racial wealth gap, where white people have many times the wealth of people of color, which results from the history and current reality of institutional racism across multiple systems in our society. And so this is the piece, again, that is the critical piece that needs to be addressed. Culture change is needed. Relationship building is needed to address the individual racism pieces to better position you to do the work of undoing systemic racism. But as you all are working together to be in meaningful relationship with each other to do this work, it really is about developing the strategies, tools, and processes needed to dismantle structural racism. So we want to pause here, because we know that was a lot, and see if there are any questions that folks have about what Tunisia and I have gone through so far.
We have a question about centering racial equity versus racial justice from Jonathan. Sorry, let me see. I'm curious if there is a reason why we framed our work as centering racial equity versus racial justice.
I have a potential response to that. Because our work is focused on the action, justice is the result of the action. And I think our work is about, as we'll get to later on in the training, in terms of how do we act, how do we operationalize the actual centering of equity.
I would agree with that, Nick. Miss Darlene, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I was just getting ready to hit the thumbs up on that. Yes, equity work is the action of achieving justice.
Were there other questions about this first part section of the training today? Okay.
All righty. Well, before we move on, as we noted at the beginning, we recognize that this is deep work. Some of this information may be new to folks, so we just want to take a quick moment to pause for people to take a second to take care of themselves, do whatever you need to do. Sometimes in sessions, I encourage people to do a waterfall breath, which is when you lift your arms when you're inhaling, put your arms down as you exhale. Just give folks a few seconds to you can also just simply breathe, whatever you need to do. All righty. And with that, I will pass it on to Darlene to guide us through understanding structural racism and its impact on homelessness.
Thank you so much. So I want to just underscore that download that you just got by saying that none of these impacts that we're going to talk about necessarily require negative intentions. So good intentions, we can assume that the intentions are good, but the work of equity requires that we become much more intentional about manifesting those intentions. And that's what we're building on, and we're coming from that position. But understanding how structural racism works and what specific examples of structural racism are helps us to what some people call decolonize our mind. So our minds have been colonized by our socialization, and our socialization includes lots of lacking information and a fair dose of misinformation and bias as well. So as we deepen our understanding of structural racism, we begin to unwind some of our unintentional and yet very, very real socialization into racist ideas and internalizing of those racist ideas. Next slide, please. So one of the things we noticed when we spoke with people who are having the lived experience of homelessness is that they had internalized racist ideas about themselves and their groups that is almost unavoidable, and so cannot be necessarily taken at its face value, but needs to be understood in order to understand the majority of the people that are impacted by homelessness, that being people of color. And so oftentimes they would describe, when we were interacting with them, themselves as being lazy or irresponsible, while others described feelings of worthlessness or shame. And I want to just highlight here that definition of internalized oppression and how it impacts people of color, that most of us have internalized some of these ideas and work throughout our entire lives to shed those ideas, which cause a lot of stress and misplaced blame that we can perpetuate on ourselves. And if we're not people of color, it's very important, as we're working with people of color, that we don't reinforce or play on in any way those internalized racist messages that people carry within themselves. We have an opportunity as we do homeless work, as a matter of fact, to contradict it through action that recognizes humanity, recognizes the existence of structural and systemic racism and the impact that it has on people's lives, and by being very transparent about walking this talk of racial justice and equity, or equity and justice. So it's important for us to understand what happened to people that has resulted in the need to have rationalizing racist ideas to explain it away for the society, so that the society doesn't have to take actions to correct for past injustices. So here's some examples. My job was to share those with you today, and I'm happy to do so. Next slide, please. So first of all, we always start with the data. When we're doing equity work, it is data-driven and outcome focused. And so we start with the disparities, and the disparities are very, very striking and distressing, disturbing, that we would have this kind of disparity that is racially predictable. I want to also point out that there are some problems with the data, and that often has to do with severely underrepresented groups like American Indians and Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, also folks that are recent immigrants within the Asian community, more recent comers in the Asian community might be underrepresented in this data. And then we know that in the Latino community, we know this from census data, that they are underrepresented in the point in time count, for example, because they tend to handle homelessness through overcrowding, doubling up, tripling up, quadrupling up in overcrowded places. So we start with this data, but we want to nuance this data by understanding that it doesn't necessarily represent everything. But what we do know is that when it comes to American Indian or indigenous peoples, as we more typically call them, this is census language here, that the indigenous people tend to fare as poorly or worse than African Americans. And there is then a color line hierarchy that distributes these kinds of negative impacts based on skin color or race, as we call it. So we start with this understanding, we ground ourselves in this understanding that we have disparities to close and that we will not end homelessness. So connect the dots in your mind between doing equity work and ending homelessness. We will not end homelessness or even significantly impact homelessness if we do not take an equitable approach because of the severe overrepresentation of particularly Black and Indigenous people and other people of color in homelessness. So there is a connection. That question was, what is the source? This is since, I think, point in time count is the main source for this. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected by consultants or others. But I believe that is
You're right.
Yeah, and we probably should have put that on the slide. We will do that next time. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we know that Black and Native Americans are represented in homelessness at 4 times the rate. That is clearly evident in the data that we have. And we also know that these disparities are linked to centuries of structural racism and the treatment of Black people with regard to the kinds of resources that any people need in order to stay housed, particularly in an overheated housing market like the Bay Area, or where I come from, Seattle, Washington, is another example. Very different city demographically, very similar outcomes. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we study this is by understanding redlining as deeply as possible. And I want you all to know that there's a book out there. If you have not read it, I believe anyone that is working with government on issues like homelessness or any form of justice really needs to understand the redlining, what its deep impacts were. And we're going to unpack a little bit of that through this part of the presentation. But there's a book called The Color of Law that I really believe anyone serving on the COC should have either read or listened to. And then there's a companion book that has just come out in the last couple of weeks called Just Action, couple of months, sorry. It's a new book, Just Action, which is the companion piece about what can be done to undo the impacts of redlining. It is not perfect, but it does offer lots of stimulating ideas, and I recommend the second book as well. Or maybe start with the second book and work backwards. It'll make you curious about the first book. Next slide, please. So we have this history of all of the things that flowed out of redlining. It wasn't just that somebody made a map, it's that it led to all these discriminatory practices by all these different institutions and systems. This is called structural racism, because when you have all these different systems working hand in glove to create the kind of disparities that we're experiencing today, then we're up at that level called structural racism, which we didn't cover. But that's that bigger picture of how all these individual institutions or differentiated institutions tend to line up functionally because of where the society is developmentally around justice. And so we end up with a very tight knit structure that has profound, long-reaching, and into the present time impacts. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you examples of some of these things that are very localized. So I picked on the city of Alameda because they're rather famous for this. Measure A was a charter amendment measure that was run by the city of Alameda in 1973 that prohibited construction of multifamily housing. This is called exclusionary zoning. And they're not the only jurisdiction to have done this. There's a pattern of this across the country and here in the Bay Area. And that's what we want to disabuse ourselves of, is that somehow the Bay Area is outside of the systemic and structural racism that is ever present in other parts of the country. I'm happy to say that city of Alameda is now looking at this. There are people who have challenged it, the rationalization about protecting the environment, et cetera. Is being challenged heartily, and robust conversations are now going on in the city of Alameda. It's not going to happen overnight, but the change conversation has begun. Next slide, please. San Leandro, nearby neighbors to Oakland as well. Restrictive covenants are pervasive in San Leandro. There is also a wall and some entryways between Oakland and San Leandro that are very clear demarcation lines with regard to sundown town behaviors of enforcement that are historically and long-standing since 1915, and probably before that in more informal ways. But these covenants, although they're now outlawed and unenforceable, the harmful language, it does remind us how intentional and on purpose this was, yes, here in the liberal Bay Area, going back over 100 years. Wow. Okay, next slide, please. That's just so hard for me to wrap my head around because of my age. But Rock Ridge is a neighborhood within Oakland. So this manifestation of structural and systemic racism happened at every level of government and at every level of activity. This is a flyer for Rock Ridge. It's now came to my attention after I got here because I wasn't born and raised in the Bay Area, but is apparently fairly well known. This is the real estate development flyer for Rock Ridge, which is just a neighborhood of Oakland now. We just refer to it casually as a neighborhood, Rock Ridge. And within this real estate advertising was the very explicit racial exclusion. No Negroes or Chinese, Japanese can build or lease in Rock Ridge. Now, that was enforced in a myriad of ways, but that they were very confident that they could assure prospective buyers and investors that they were not going to have to deal with race, et cetera, et cetera. So this was explicit, it was out loud, it was at the time very, very socially acceptable. So it really ran rampant through society, and the Bay Area was included. Next slide, please. Elimination of redevelopment agencies and funding. Now, this goes directly to our ability to have, over the last decades, since 2012, the ability to continue to produce very low-income housing that was sufficiently subsidized by the state to make that housing possible. Cities are at the bottom of the food chain economically in the fourth largest economy in the world, called California. Cities are still at the bottom of the food chain with regard to distribution of those resources. Counties are next in line, and so on up the food chain. And the real control of the big money that is the economy of the state of California resides with the state of California. And this is an example about how things that had previously been in place in the state of California to support those who are most marginalized and impacted by racial disparities. This is an example of things that have been systematically defunded over the last decades that have contributed mightily to the current conditions that we see in Alameda County. Everything from health to education, right? It's not just this, but this directly impacted our ability to produce very low-income housing subsidized by the state. Next slide. There is something called displacement and disruption that is caused by so-called progress. These freeways were designed that cut through West Oakland and surround West Oakland, which was the heart of the Black community until this happened, till this disruption began to really disintegrate the community in West Oakland. They were all designed to serve the suburbs and the white flight to the suburbs that was perpetuated by social changes through the civil rights movement. So they were, if not intentionally placed to punish the Black community that had made some progress through civil rights, they certainly functioned in that way. And that's the thing about systemic racism, is we don't look at what were the intentions or what were the people saying or doing, because we can't really know. Most of us were not in the rooms where this happened. But what we can do is clearly see how it functioned, and the function was historically and still resonates and impacts the city of Oakland directly. Over 5,000 what we would now consider affordable homes were destroyed by these actions. More than 5,000 homes. That would cover all the homeless that we have on record in the city of Oakland right now. Next slide, please. The other thing we want to look at is the way that systemic and structural racism has structured economic mobility. So the ability to go to and move back and forth between different locations, to relocate for safety or relocate for affordability or relocate for jobs, that ability is hinged greatly to economic mobility. It's much easier to make different choices and to situate ourselves and our families the more economically mobile we are. I heard a new term yesterday called economic, oh, I just left my mind. It's brand new. It's a concept that Harvard University is working on. But it's really, this is really at the core of so much of our lives. If we're economically stable, our entire lives are likely to unfold differently. And you can see there are huge disparities in this. They are getting worse in the Bay Area, certainly, and in other areas where we have these disparities, they are not getting better. The cost of college debt, all of the ways that these things like that we measure mobility by are actually getting worse for African Americans and Indigenous people. The wealth gap is growing. The income gap goes up and down a little bit for African Americans particularly, but the wealth gap is getting bigger over time because of the ability to buy homes and all of the things that we previously talked about. So this is a picture that is very shaky for Black people in the Bay Area, and it fully explains why Black folks are so overrepresented in homelessness, because without economic mobility and stability in a overheated real estate market in a city that used to be affordable, it's not a complicated analysis to see how that would result in these levels of homelessness in the city of Oakland. Next slide, please. I'm going to speed it up. This is my last slide. I need to pass this off to Nick. He's got more to say. We need to say last and foremost, a practice that has yet to end. It still goes on in banking and other financial institutions, discriminatory and predatory lending, And there are recent lawsuits being filed. There's also been a lawsuit filed on behalf of Latinos, and I just didn't make a separate slide. But this doesn't just impact Black folks. It also impacts Latinos, particularly people that are perceived as being immigrants and that sort of thing. People with an accent, people with speak. Oh, thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. I didn't set a timer, so I was worried. So we know that predatory lending, this is also, I want to mention here that predatory rental treatment also persists, and HUD does periodic testing about discrimination in renting to people of color by sending out test couples or test people to rent apartments, and sending white applicants as well as people of color applicants, and they consistently uncover to this day blatant discrimination in decisions about who a rental unit is going to be rented to without regard to someone's ability to pay the rent. So these discriminatory practices go on into this day because of anti-Black racism, particularly, and so also plenty of other examples as well. And we have to keep in mind that this is going to be impacting our people of color in Alameda County for some time to come, because these are the aspects of systemic and structural racism that are very hard to undo, because they actually mostly happen at an interpersonal level. They are decisions that are being made at the level of giving people a loan or giving people. So we need more pressure on landlords, institutions, and probably more penalties and more enforcement around discriminatory practices. None of these laws that hinge to equal housing laws, we have laws against that kind of discrimination. They're very clear that you cannot, you must not, you should not discriminate in lending or in rental decisions. But because it happens at this very low level of interpersonal decisions, it is hard to enforce, and it has rarely been enforced with any consistency by the federal government or anyone else. So this is, I think the main thing I want to say here is it's going to take a while for us to unwind these racist ideas and these racist behaviors that happen at this level. But what we can remember about our clients is that they are being impacted by it right now. It's not something that happened long ago and in the past. It is impacting their lives now, and it is likely to impact their lives for the foreseeable future. So the COC's decision-making and strategic directions also need to take that into consideration. So that is my last slide. That's the last of my examples. I hope this has been helpful in grounding you in how and why this work is critical. And also notice that all of these things were done, and if they were done by human beings at the time, and they were, and we can show that they were, they can be undone or responded to with an equity approach by human beings that are here now, because we're the ones that are up to bat. It's our turn to write a different page in history. And that for me is very exciting that I get to be part of that with you all, and in my work, 7 days a week. So thank you so much for your attention. Nick, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Darlene. We want to pause for a moment here if there are questions for the slides Darlene presented.
Thank you for the kind comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So my name is Nick Ming. I use a he or they pronoun. I serve on the Racial Equity Committee. I'm helping us to go through the section about system design and evaluation to advance our racial equity goals. I want to, as we transition to the next slide, I want to mention Jonathan's comment earlier, Jonathan's question earlier, as well as Michelle's comment in the chat to Darlene's mention that funding for affordable housing in California at the state level ended in 2012. And Michelle put a comment in the chat that some federal funding got decreased significantly in the same year, and just ask us to hold that in terms of the convergence or coincidence of those of that year with those around those significant pieces. Can we transition to the next slide? because it helps us, I think, to get a vantage point in terms of understanding why we need to have system design and evaluation work that's grounded in equity. And for me, the short answer is it helps us to understand cause and effects and functions. And mentioned like with that 2012 set of events around 2012 at the systemic and institutional level, what that creates a decade later in terms of actual reality and effects, and how those occurrences function in terms of expediting or compounding challenges that folks face. And so the why we need to ground or system design and evaluation work in equity is important and also necessary, because it helps us to understand how structural racism impacts and multiplies and intensifies the kinds of barriers that people face, and who are the people who are facing these barriers to housing instability, and the number of things that result from that in terms of discrimination, and how race appears and interactions about race may appear neutral and unbiased when they may not necessarily be so in truth and in fact, and based on what data evidences in particular. And so the why, understanding why, again, is helpful for us to understand how these barriers play out or happen in people's real lives on an individual and family and household, meaning family basis, and the kinds of experiences they have around homelessness. Homelessness, in short, is like an effect of the systemic and structural issues that have happened in people's lives over time. And in many and to Darlene's point earlier, that's why it's important as far as grounding in our work and our action in equity is concerned, in terms of looking for a multi-pronged approach. What's happening to the person here, addressing what's happened upstream, so to speak, that led to this, like 2012 has led to some of the fallout that's happening, has triggered and intensified the fallout that's happening now, and what may happen in the future, meaning what's the impact of what we're doing. So we get to address structural racism in very many ways, as far as understanding why it's important to ground the work in our design and evaluation of equity. And just to read from the slides here, structural racism impacts the entire families, impacts entire families and social system, and it distresses the networks and support systems that may otherwise prevent homelessness. Like I mentioned, way upstream, a lot of things are happening. People lived in redlined neighborhoods. It meant environmentally they faced different challenges in terms of pollutants, for example, and so forth. The level of education they get impacts the kind of economic or socioeconomic mobility that folks can obtain. So all that happens at some point down the line, homelessness becomes an effect of it. And structural racism continues to label Black and Indigenous people as high risk. Communication impacts our thinking and our structural systems that we use mentally as well to understand and interact with people. And so how people, of course, we know in terms of how people get labeled, relate to stereotypes being embedded or entrenched as far as racism is concerned, or racist ideologies. All that is very much interconnected and related. And of course, low-income communities of color are being displaced from Alameda County in terms of what's actually happening on the ground, and homelessness services may also be participating in that displacement. And that part of the why for us is about the self-reflection and a constant questioning in terms of how may we be continuing harm and injustice despite our best intentions or being well-intentioned. And so we want to be able to recognize the barriers, that these barriers, addressing these barriers, help us to address challenges that arise from structural racism as we get to the granularities in terms of policies, interventions that we put in place and so forth to support folks around the realities that they may have in terms of longer lease-up periods for some folks, harder requirements or more stringent or more increased requirements, like for instance, additional down payment. The word escapes me for like rent and so forth, for like renting a unit, and of course how people get trapped in terms of cycles of racial trauma and prolonged racial trauma that they experience from episodes of homelessness. We can move forward. Deposit, thank you, Kim. Deposit, increased deposit requirements are some of the things that people may face. And so as we, wrap our minds around the why of things, it helps us to understand and think about the perspective that we need to have in terms of approaching our work and our practice of racial equity and operationalizing racial equity. And one of the primary tools that we need to use and utilize as far as operationalizing and approaching racial equity is concerned is the racial equity impact analysis. And this is a process, it's a tool. There are many ways you can describe it. It's a set of principles, guidelines in terms of being able to effectively walk through approaching, something at the granular level or the more systemic level, where one has a concern or wants to understand how racial equity or racial inequity may be operating on that particular issue. I want to pause for a second here, because a lot of our work that we're going to do at the committee level, the leadership board level, and for the COC as a whole, is about us wrapping our minds around the tools to be able to operationalize racial equity work in the different areas that we're responsible for. So a lot of this information isn't being presented on this occasion only. We will get into it again and again as far as when we get into like presenting the tools and so forth for committees to use. So I just want to elevate that, and so folks can, if they have questions stemming from this conversation, there'll be more than ample opportunity for us to be able to address any questions that you leave this session and think about afterwards. So as far as racial equity impact analysis is concerned, there are a few things that it involves, right? One is the examination of how different racial ethnic groups and racial and/or ethnic groups are likely to be impacted by a proposed action or decision that's made. And so the racial equity impact analysis is one of the tools that help us to understand, to reduce, eliminate, to understand what those effects may be, to reduce, eliminate, and/or prevent racial discrimination and/or inequities that may arise from or action or decision, and to identify options that can address long-standing inequities. Again, to the point in terms of addressing what's happened before this particular moment, in terms of serving the folks who are most impacted in the moment that you are. And so the second thing that's important about racial equity impact analysis is that they're used to minimize unintended or unanticipated adverse consequences in a variety of contexts. And that may be from including like our analysis of policies, looking at procedures, programs, operations, plans that we may have, and most importantly, our decision making around all those areas, and of course our decision making around budgets and finance. And the third area that a racial equity impact analysis helps us to really dive into that significant is how we leverage and deploy existing resources. What's gone ahead that we don't necessarily need to recreate, but spin an existing wheel to be able to gain energy. So that may include what's already looked at as far as our racial equity impact analyses are concerned about a particular topic or plan, and different processes that can support that. Next slide, please. And so this is from the one of the tools developed by Darlene's team at the Department of Race and Equity in Oakland. And it's the steps that will help us to understand, like, what do we need to do when we're talking about actually actioning and completing a racial equity impact analysis. And our first step, as Darlene mentioned earlier, equity work is very data-driven and outcome-focused. And so we start with our focus, and that would be, what's the future desire? What's the desired future condition? What do we want to see from an equity standpoint in our system? Do you want to see better results, service to folks who are most impacted racially, Black, brown folks who are Native American, among some of those populations? What does that look like for us? So we identify those things. And then we use data to drive our understanding of the current conditions, what's led to those conditions, and how we may begin to address those conditions. So we get data on a number of things, what does poverty look like? How is poverty contributing to homelessness amid a scenario where there's hyper-capitalism in terms of market rates for housing being affected? And how is that compounded by a 2012 decision at the federal and state level to not produce or produce affordable housing? Now, step 3 in the racial equity impact analysis is to work with the communities that are most impacted. And so we want to be able to make sure that we have a complete root cause analysis that deepens our understanding of the problem. And to be able to do that requires information from the folks who are most impacted. And then also to determine how they can be not just recipients, but participants in terms of comprehensive and being able to find comprehensive solutions or responsive solution or responses to the situations that they're facing. So we want to have their active participation and involvement in terms of producing partnerships and collaboration to respond effectively and thoroughly to the circumstances that homelessness entail. And then we want to make sure that whatever design approach and equity approaches that we have, that we're pretty rigorous with them in terms of the performance measures. So we can talk, and be all, fluffy and so forth with equity and look at the data in terms of what's happened there before, but what will happen with what we're doing now to address the root causes of the disparities, address some of the things that led to, and not just what's needed in the moment for the person right here. So we want to be able to look at the barriers, not just the particular occurrence of homelessness that a person is in right now. And one key component of another key component of the racial equity impact analysis is part of the evaluation and monitoring process in terms of having a continuous loop to evaluate, assess what's happening, and then being able to make necessary steps for continuous improvement to get to the desired future conditions that we want to see in step 1. I'm going to pause here because I see a number of things happening in the chat and invite any comments that people want to raise or questions. I can't necessarily, I just see the things popping up that there's something happening, so I can't necessarily
Nick, it's
see.
Michelle. I have a
Yeah,
question.
please.
Thank you. This
Hi,
is
Michelle.
really, how are you?
Pretty good.
I think that, you're right. Looking back gives us the analysis, but looking forward is the actions that we need to take. And as we look at possible new money, we need to be specifically planning programs and planning opportunities that will address these issues. And I think you know, Prop 209 kind of ties our hands to tie things specifically to racial outcomes. But if we focus on extremely low income programs, I think that really helps. But we have new money coming, and we really do need to dig in right now so that in a year, when there are possible ballot measures, folks know what we want to spend the money on.
Point taken. Any other comments? In relation to Michelle's comment, Michelle, I think this is us beginning to, with us beginning to share this information here, I think it helps us to make some of the steps to enable, equip committees to begin to do this, some of this work, to frame some of that digging in before the next year. So I think we're maybe just baby stepping now towards it, not making a giant leaps or bounces that we need to make yet, but I think we're in action. All right, next slide, please. And so again, to that process of evaluation and the evaluation that leads to continuous quality improvement, we definitely want to recognize, as we said before, that equity analysis isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing integrated component of equity work, and incorporating equity goals into our project and project or proposal design is a key step. And then being able to, again, routinely look at our data in a very rigorous manner and being able to share that data in ways that are accessible to our stakeholders, for instance, like on public-facing dashboards, being able to engage and have active partnership or participation from our collaborators, especially centering the folks with lived expertise or direct lived experiences of homelessness and housing instability. And it recognizing that quality improvement is about constantly being or constantly returning to the drawing board and iterating and updating where necessary. And then recognizing that we are going to make mistakes, and so the need to be able to course correct in ways that it can be as agile and less bureaucratic as possible is an important feature in this work as well. Next slide, please. So we want to think of all of this in terms of how we can bring it down to a more local level. For the next slide. So as far as being in our particular context is concerned, again, in terms of some framing, what we saw between 2017 and even up to 2020, 21 or so, but it began to be more pronounced between 2017 and 2019, was that with the surge in homelessness, it was also very evident that this was disproportionately impacting certain racial groups and others. And so at the system level, it led to us questioning, how can the system modeling work and process ensure that, we get to better outcomes. And that question led us to trying to think of how can we better apply a racial equity lens to the work that we're doing. And so the system modeling process sought to identify and address the factors that led to the overrepresentation of folks, people of color in the population that's experiencing homelessness. The process also sought to understand how facets of the homelessness crisis response system benefit or burden folks, especially people of color, and pinpoint opportunities to advance more racially equitable outcomes or results within the system. It also meant that we were trying to formulate key questions or question certain elements of the system, certain critical elements of the system, including what would be the best types and quantities of housing interventions, units, service, the types of services and programs. So the very model, what the components of the very model itself, how adequate were those existing pieces at the time was one of the big questions for us. And to be able to develop recommendations to more effectively and equitably allocate these resources, prioritize where investment needs to happen, to advance more proactive strategies, to advance proactive targeted strategies to end, and also again going back upstream to prevent homelessness where necessary, where it could be done. Next slide, please. And so between late 2019, early 2020, there are a number of folks gathering in the COC to address this, think about this. They were elected officials, civil servants, different service providers, funders, different stakeholders, including folks with lived expertise or lived experience of homelessness, working together, having conversations and working together to design a model to end homelessness in Alameda County. And I'm just seeing a note here that we got an update to the system modeling work. There's a more recent update to the system modeling work, and so that team, was established to help to develop and apply the racial equity, to lay the foundation or groundwork at least, so that our response system could have. I'm so sorry. I with my learning style, the chats can sometimes derail where my vision is, and so so as far as the racial equity impact analysis team is concerned, it was established to develop and apply the lens to the modeling effort, to the system modeling efforts. And the racial equity impact analysis team found that the homeless response system didn't have the interventions needed to permanently rehouse to serve and permanently rehouse folks experiencing homelessness. And reducing the disparities and improving outcomes for the racial and ethnic groups that are most impacted would require a new and updated model, so to speak, with different components. The program types and interventions that are available, and how these are designed and delivered. Next slide, please. And so, to provide a kind of nutshell in terms of how some of that work has unfolded in the period. We start by being in terms of being outcome focused. One of the outcomes or goals so far in terms of the work that's happened has been about power distribution and alignment of how power is distributed with the whole responsibilities held in the COC. Some of the actual strategies that have been deployed to get us action in that regard have been around actually revising the governance charter, being able to identify what the various entities are that are involved and how they relate to each other as far as creating structural checks and balances are concerned. And remember, again, this is crucial to Chloe's earlier mention in terms of how institutional or institutionalized racism functions, and for us to be able to address the work that our COC is doing as an institution to create better and more equitable outcomes. Another outcome that we aspired towards was about embedding anti-racist practices in the COC. One of the ways that's unfolded so far has been around in more intentional inclusion. And so our committees, for instance, and work groups have a requirement for a basic, a minimum number of seats as our voting membership, as far as including folks with lived experience, as well as folks who are BIPOC. There are certain requirements. There's an actual benchmark written into our charter, for instance, as part of that. And then the third outcome involves creating or enabling us to have an effective, high-performing, anti-racist, and multicultural COC. Again, our committee structures in terms of lending to that and embedding anti-racism or the practice of racial equity in our committee. One of the things that we've done is to incorporate racial equity framework and the liaisons as part of that framework as one of the key components to help with the communication among committees and within the COC to address racial equity or to provide a racial equity lens or framework for the committee's work that's supported by the racial equity committee. I want if we can transition to the next slide, or was that my last slide? Okay, so you may have questions, you may not have questions. Let's see what's happening. But I think that's kind of like the end of our presentation. So this is our general time for comments if we want to elevate anything that happened in the chat. Like I mentioned, a lot of the work that we're going to do as far as operationalizing and practicing equity and implementing frameworks for our tools or using tools to help us to advance racial equity will involve, especially this segment again about our system design and evaluation to advance equity. So you will hear this in different ways coming back at you. Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements and then we can go back to discussion and questions. But basically, this is a lot of information. We know it's a lot to take in. This is going to be posted on the website so everyone can revisit and take a second look if they would like to. We do have follow-up items coming related to racial equity. There is the October community meeting, which will be a broad meeting, October the 26th for the general public. And then for seated committee members, we are doing a part 2 anti-racism training on October the 25th. You should be seeing an invite for that. If you haven't already, it'll be today. But we're inviting everyone to come to the Cal Endowment Center where we will do both an in-person and hybrid Zoom anti-racism training. We're also planning additional workshops and conversations around these topics, some of which may happen in the newly created Racial Equity Committee that'll be full of our newly elected racial equity liaisons, but there will also be other opportunities for broader training for the COC membership as we go forward. This is just the beginning. And with that, I will open it up for questions. We've got about 15 minutes left where we can have broad discussion and questions. And thank you all again for coming and listening to our conversation. Getting lots of positive feedback in the chat. I'm glad this is resonating with people. Thank you all so much for your input and thoughts here.
I want to acknowledge a point from Maria, I think, in terms of our question about how we can make this training. The COC Leadership Board does have some interaction and relationship with several cities and their mayor's office. And so maybe we can send this material to them, but of course, we can't make anything required training for anyone.
Or,
Um,
even offer them to
yes,
come through a training like this. So, I sit on the Hayward City Council, and I'm definitely going to talk to our mayor today and see how this can come to Hayward. Because
yeah,
as we make decisions around homelessness issues and housing, I can tell you we have one of the most progressive councils in the county, and we're still not all centered around the importance of having a racial equity lens. So I just think something proactive in reaching out and offering this training intentionally to officials who are going to be the ones making the policy decisions related to this is going to be important.
thanks for mentioning that and elevating it, Ray. Kim, that's your forte
Yeah,
in
I mean,
terms of, yeah,
noted.
the leadership board. Yeah, that would be, I think, coming from the leadership board, we can look have that discussion about how that could be initiated.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, thank you too.
Jen, you've had your hand raised for a while.
Oh no, I lowered it and then I raised it again. Yeah, thank you so much for this great training and for all the presenters. I just wanted to mention that if folks are going to be talking to their city councils or in any parts in the training where you want to share updated data, Nick, I know you talked about the Centering Racial Equity and Homeless System Design report, which is incredible and was the really informed the Home Together 2026 plan. I did just in the chat, I had mentioned that system modeling was done additionally and slightly updated. And then there has been one annual progress update done to look at kind of where the county is, where the data is. So there is some data about system-wide outcomes looking at race and ethnicity in that data. So that's a place where you could look at updated data. And we also hopefully will have our year 2 data up soon. I'll put in the chat, the county or Office of Homeless Care and Coordination does have some data dashboards where you can look at all sorts of demographic factors, including race and ethnicity for different system-wide outcomes. But just in case you want to, bring that additional data with the discussion about racial equity.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah. Deidre.
Yeah, I appreciate the training. And I'd like to be able to look over the PowerPoint to review because it's very important. And I'd like to be able to reread it again.
Yes, we will share out the PowerPoint slides with the group. I'm wondering if anyone here is, thinking about serving as a racial equity liaison and wondering if any of this is really particularly resonating with people. If you think, yeah, this is something I want to keep talking about and want to be in more spaces. These are the kinds of conversations that we try to have in racial equity work group and are planning to have on racial equity committee. So if you want a preview of what it would be like to be liaison, it's conversations like this and really trying to make it actionable on like how can it happen within the work that we own and coordinate as a COC. We have the whole group of racial equity work group here today. There's 3 official members plus some TA support. So if anyone has questions about what that's like or what kind of projects we have going on, this would be a great time.
I just wanted to mention that sometimes if people are a little bit shy about raising it in a group setting, you should feel free to reach out to any of us too, and just speak with us directly about the vision for this work and how we're organizing it to hopefully permeate through all the committees, which is really the theory of change that we're working on. Is not that the committee that we're on, the Racial Equity Committee, would be doing all the equity thinking, but that we would be infusing this equity thinking across the entire COC and all of its work groups. So we're hoping that we have teased. I saw at least one person say, I'm interested in the chat, to Kim's point, have piqued your interest and helped you understand that this is methodical work we're doing. It's not as scary as we sometimes think it is. If you haven't done racial justice or anti-racism work before, it's not as daunting. It's work, it's a lift. There are steps and intentionalities we need to adopt and go through, but it can be quite methodical and very satisfying. I've worked over the last 20 years with countless numbers of people who have become activated around doing this work in their environment. And so many of them come back and express how much this has enriched their work, how it has taken their thinking about the effort that is being made deeper and given it more meaning and purpose. And we hope that it's going to support the COC in that same way, not just what's happening externally, but also what happens for us as we grow and become those change agents instead of gatekeepers. It's a big transition. Most of us that come from or through bureaucracies, we're socialized very heavily about being gatekeepers. We know how to do that really well if we've been in government for any amount of time. It comes with the territory. So this shift from gatekeeper to change agent is a profound one that actually not only serves our community better, but also actually serves us. There is a self-interest in this that shouldn't be discounted, because it does require extra effort from us. We have to learn new things. We have to use new tools. We need to refine our vocabulary and our communication skills about it. These are all assignments, but the value in it, the payback is at least double the effort, because it changes outcomes in our most impacted communities, and it changes us, and in a good way. I mean, it enriches our lives. It's not about becoming a better person. It's about having a richer purpose in our work. So I would just add that as part of the pitch.
Okay, well, we've got a little bit more than 5 minutes left in our time. If there's additional questions, we will hang out. And if you don't have additional questions, you are free to go. I think we're good here. But thank you again, everyone, for coming to this training series. This is the third of the and final recorded training that we're going to do for new COC committee members. Looking forward to seeing everyone in person October 25th and 26th. It's going to be really nice to see you all at the Cal Endowment Center.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us.